I know you. The crystal chandelier overhead dripped light onto the sea of black ties and silk gowns, a constellation of wealth and influence. Alara felt a universe away, her plain black uniform a shadow against the room's glittering tapestry. She moved with practiced efficiency, a ghost with a tray of champagne flutes, her focus narrowed to the task at hand. Collect, replace, disappear. It was a rhythm she knew well, one that kept her invisible and safe. But then she saw him. He stood near the grand marble fireplace, a head taller than the sycophants orbiting him, his presence a quiet gravitational pull in the noisy room. Julian Croft, CEO of Croft Enterprises, philanthropist, and the city's most talked-about widower. His face, etched with a familiar, deep-seated weariness she'd only ever seen in photographs, was now just a few feet away. Her breath caught. The rhythm broke. The tray in her hands felt impossibly heavy. It wasn't the man from the magazines she saw, the titan of industry with a gaze that could freeze markets. It was the man from the park. The man with the worn-out coat and the lost look in his eyes. The one who had sat on a bench 3 weeks ago, watching his children play with a sorrow so profound it had seemed to bleed into the autumn air around him. She had been on her break from her other job, the one at the diner, sketching the pigeons in her worn notepad. He hadn't noticed her then. He noticed her now. His gaze, a cool, searching gray, swept the room and snagged on hers. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed mask of the billionaire slipped. He saw not a server but a face. A flicker of confusion, of vague recognition, crossed his features before being smoothed away. But it was too late. The connection, however fleeting, had been made. A guest, a woman with diamonds dripping from her ears, beckoned impatiently. Alara moved forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She offered a flute of champagne, her hand steady despite the tremor that ran through her. As the woman took the glass, Julian Croft stepped closer, his voice a low rumble that cut through the surrounding chatter. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes not on the guest, but on her. His proximity was overwhelming, a mix of expensive cologne and an almost electric intensity. She felt the carefully built walls of her anonymity crumbling. The need to stay invisible warred with an impulse she couldn't explain. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, a whisper that was somehow louder than all the noise in the room. "I know you." The statement hung in the air between them, sharp and startling. The woman with the diamonds raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Julian's expression hardened, a shield of polite, professional distance slamming down. He likely thought she was another sycophant, another person trying to leverage a passing glance into an opportunity. "I'm sure you do," he said, his tone clipped, dismissive. He was already turning away, ready to be swallowed back into his world. But Alara couldn't let it go. It wasn't about his fame or his money. It was about the raw, unguarded grief she had seen on that park bench, a grief that mirrored the hollow ache in her own chest. "No," she said, her voice finding a sliver of strength. "From the park. With your children. You dropped this." Her hand went to the small pocket of her apron, and she pulled out a small, slightly crumpled object. It was a child's drawing, a crayon portrait of a smiling stick figure with bright yellow hair, labeled "Mommy" in wobbly letters. He had dropped it when he'd finally stood to leave, and she had picked it up, intending to return it, but he had already been gone. Julian Croft froze. His turn was slow, deliberate, his eyes fixed on the drawing in her hand, and the entire world, with its champagne and its diamonds, seemed to fall away. The mask was gone, replaced by a vulnerability so stark it was breathtaking. Everyone was watching now, but for that one, silent moment, it was just the two of them, a maid and a millionaire, connected by a piece of paper that held the weight of a shattered family. The shock wasn't just on his face. It rippled through the curious onlookers, a silent gasp that changed everything. 3 weeks earlier, the interview had been a blur of polished mahogany and intimidating silence. Alara had answered the advertisement for a live-in housekeeper and nanny, a long shot she'd taken out of sheer desperation. The agency had sent her to the Croft residence, A place that wasn't a house but an estate. A modern fortress of glass and stone that seemed to disapprove of the city skyline it dominated. She had expected to be interviewed by a stern house manager in a crisp suit. Instead, she was led into a vast, minimalist library where a man in faded jeans and a simple gray sweater was struggling to fix a wobbly leg on a small wooden chair. He looked up, a smudge of dust on his cheek, and offered a tired, apologetic smile. "Sorry about the mess. Leo thinks it's a trampoline." He didn't introduce himself as Julian Croft. He just said, "I'm Lily and Leo's dad." He seemed more like a weary handyman than a captain of industry. He asked her few questions about her experience, and more about what she liked to read, if she knew any good knock-knock jokes, and whether she thought a 7-year-old was too old to believe in garden gnomes. Elara, accustomed to presenting a polished, professional version of herself, found herself speaking plainly. She talked about her mother's recipe for tomato soup, the only cure for a bad day. She admitted she was terrible at jokes but could make up stories on the spot. And she confessed that she absolutely believed in garden gnomes, because a little bit of magic never hurt anyone. It was then that the door creaked open. A little girl with her father's serious gray eyes and a storm cloud of dark hair peeked in. This was Lily, aged 7. Behind her, a small boy with a shock of blonde hair and a mischievous glint in his eye tried to push past. "Leo, 5. Dad, Lily won't share the red crayon," Leo announced, his voice full of righteous indignation. "Because you're not supposed to draw on the walls." "Leo?" Lily retorted, clutching a box of crayons to her chest like a shield. Julian sighed, the sound heavy with a familiar parental exhaustion. He looked at Elara, a silent apology in his eyes. Elara simply knelt down, bringing herself to their level. She didn't address the argument. Instead, she looked at the smudge of red crayon on Leo's cheek. "That's a very brave color," she said softly. Leo blinked, his anger momentarily forgotten. "It's rocket ship red," he declared. "Is it a fast rocket ship?" she asked, her voice a gentle murmur. He nodded vigorously. "The fastest in the whole universe." She then turned her gaze to Lily, who was still guarding her crayons. "I bet a fast rocket ship like that needs a very good navigator to draw the star maps. Do you happen to know a good navigator?" Lily's guarded expression softened almost imperceptibly. She glanced from Elara to her father, a silent question in her eyes. Julian just watched, his own expression unreadable. In the days that followed, after she was hired on a trial basis, the house began to change in small, almost invisible ways. Elara discovered that the silence was a symptom of grief. The children's mother, an artist, had passed away a year ago, and the vibrant colors of their lives had faded to gray. The kitchen, a sterile expanse of stainless steel, had never smelled of baking bread. Elara changed that. Using a battered recipe book inherited from her own mother, she filled the space with the scent of cinnamon, chocolate chip cookies, and slowly simmering soup. She didn't push. She invited. She'd leave a bowl of cookie dough on the counter and a small apron nearby. Leo, drawn by the smell, was the first to succumb. Soon, his small hands were covered in flour, his giggles echoing in a room that had been silent for too long. Lily was a harder fortress to breach. She spent most of her time in her room, a silent little ghost. Elara noticed she never drew anymore, though her room was filled with art supplies. One afternoon, Elara sat on the floor outside Lily's closed door with her own sketchbook and a simple charcoal pencil. She didn't knock. She just started to draw the pattern of the light falling through the hallway window. After 20 minutes of quiet scratching, the door opened a crack. Lily watched her, her expression wary. "What are you drawing?" she finally whispered. "Just the light," Elara said, not looking up. "Sometimes it's nice to draw things you can't hold." She left the sketchbook and pencil on the floor when she went to start dinner. The next morning, she found it back in her room. Tucked inside was a new drawing, a shaky but determined sketch of a small, smiling garden gnome. It was the first real moment of bonding, a silent understanding that passed between a grieving child and a woman who knew that sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to create something new. Julian watched it all from a distance, a ghost in his own home. He'd come home from the office, intending to retreat to his study, but would find himself lingering in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Alara patiently show Leo how to knead dough, listening to the sound of his son's unrestrained laughter. He saw her teaching Lily how to braid her hair, their heads bent together in a bubble of quiet concentration. These were moments of intimacy he had forgotten how to create, a language of care he no longer knew how to speak. He was the provider, the protector, but Alara was the warmth. She was slowly, carefully, breathing life back into the hollow spaces of their home. One cookie, one story, one quiet drawing at a time. Julian Croft hadn't built a global empire by being a trusting man. He vetted business partners with forensic precision and analyzed market trends with cold, detached logic. Trust, in his world, was a commodity to be earned, not given. And so, despite the tentative warmth seeping back into his home, a part of him remained skeptical of Alara. She was too good, too patient, too perfect. He needed to know if her kindness was genuine or a beautifully constructed performance for the benefit of a wealthy employer. The test was not a conscious, malicious plan. It was an impulse born of cynicism and a desperate need to believe. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of board meetings and hostile negotiations, he came home later than usual. The house was quiet. A single lamp was on in the living room, casting a soft glow on the couch where Alara was reading a story to Leo, who was already half asleep in her lap. Lily was curled up at the other end, fast asleep, a sketchbook resting on her chest. The scene was so painfully domestic, so full of the peace he'd thought was lost forever, that it both soothed and unsettled him. He walked through the room to his study, unstrapping his watch and placing it on the large oak desk. He pulled his wallet from his jacket, a thick black leather rectangle, and set it down next to the watch. He paused. Inside was over $2,000 in cash, several high-limit credit cards, and his driver's license, an object of immense value and identity. On impulse, he picked it up and walked back into the living room. Alara looked up as he approached, a soft smile on her face as she gently placed a finger to her lips, indicating the sleeping children. He nodded, and as he passed the end table next to the couch, he let the wallet slip from his hand. It landed on the plush rug with a soft thud. He didn't break his stride. He continued up the stairs to his room, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and dread. He was giving her an opportunity. The money was a fortune to someone in her position. It would be her word against his. She could take some or all of it and he would have his answer. The house would be safe from a predator, but the warmth would be extinguished. He wanted her to fail to prove his cynical view of the world correct. And he was terrified that she would. He showered and changed, the water doing little to wash away his tension. He paced his room, waiting. He heard her soft footsteps as she carried the children to their beds, one by one. He heard the gentle click of their doors. He heard her moving through the downstairs, tidying up, turning off lights. The silence stretched. An hour passed. He finally descended the stairs, his bare feet silent on the cold marble. The house was dark except for the moonlight filtering through the massive windows. He walked to the end table. The wallet was gone. A cold, bitter disappointment washed over him. He had been right. It was all an act. The kindness, the stories, the patient smiles, a long con. He felt a fool for his weakness, for allowing himself to hope. He walked into his study, the room feeling more like a tomb than ever. And there, on the polished surface of his desk, placed squarely in the center of his leather blotter, was his wallet. Next to it was a small, folded piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. It was a note, written in Alara's neat, simple script. "Mr. Croft, you dropped this. I was worried you might need it in the morning. I also took the liberty of making you a sandwich. It's in the fridge. You look like you haven't eaten all day. Alara." He sank into his desk chair, the wallet feeling heavy in his hand. It wasn't just that she had returned it. It was the quiet, unassuming way she had done it. There was no fanfare, no self-righteous presentation to prove her honesty. She had simply done the right thing, assuming he had made a mistake. And then, she had thought of him. Not of his wealth or his power, but of his hunger, of his exhaustion. She had seen the weary man, not the millionaire. He remembered their first meeting, when he'd been in his worn jeans, posing as just a dad. He'd done it to see if applicants would treat him differently, if they were there for the job or the name. She had spoken to him with the same direct, gentle respect she showed him now. She had passed that test, too, without even knowing she was being graded. The sandwich in the fridge, a simple turkey on rye, felt more significant than any multi-million-dollar deal he had ever closed. It was an act of simple, unadorned care. In that moment, Julian Croft understood. Alara's currency wasn't money. It was kindness. And in his cold, sterile world, that made her the wealthiest person he had ever met. The test was over. He had his answer, and he was the one who felt like he had failed. The quiet strength Alara projected was a carefully tended garden grown over rocky soil. Her past wasn't a dramatic tragedy, but a slow, steady erosion of dreams. She had been a gifted artist in high school, her sketchbook her most prized possession. An acceptance letter to a prestigious art institute in the city had been her ticket to a different life, a world of canvas and color that existed far beyond her small, working-class town. But 2 weeks before she was set to leave, her mother, her greatest champion, had received a devastating diagnosis. The scholarship covered tuition, but it couldn't cover the mounting medical bills or the cost of a full-time caregiver. Without a second thought, Alara had put her life on hold. She took a job at the local diner, her days smelling of coffee and grease instead of turpentine and oil paint. She learned to give injections, to read the subtle signs of pain, to sit for hours in silent companionship. Her sketchbook gathered dust. After her mother passed away 2 years later, the grief was a heavy cloak, and the debt was a mountain. The dream of art school seemed like a story from someone else's life. She moved to the city, not for art, but for survival, stringing together low-wage jobs, each one chipping away a little more of the girl who used to see the world in brushstrokes. Her wound wasn't a scar. It was a phantom limb, an ache for the life she had almost lived. She'd reveal it in small, unconscious ways. Julian would find her staring at the abstract paintings his late wife, Amelia, had created, her expression a mixture of reverence and a deep, wistful sorrow. One evening, Lily showed Alara a new drawing. "It's for Mommy," she said, her voice small. "I hope she can see it in heaven." Alara hugged the little girl, her own eyes glistening. "I'm sure she can," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that went deeper than empathy. "And I'm sure she loves it." Julian, watching from the doorway, saw not just a nanny comforting his child, but a woman who understood, with every fiber of her being, what it meant to lose the person who believed in you most. Julian's own wound was more visible but just as raw. Amelia had been the light and color in his monochromatic world of balance sheets and projections. She was an artist wild and free, who had seen past the CEO to the quiet, serious man beneath. Her death in a sudden car accident had been a brutal amputation. He hadn't just lost his wife, he had lost his anchor. In the aftermath, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. He threw himself into his company, building it higher, stronger, as if constructing a fortress around his grief. But the fortress became a prison, cutting him off from the very people who needed him most. His children. He loved them with a fierce, protective ache, but he didn't know how to reach them across the chasm of his own pain. He provided for them, but he couldn't connect with them. He outsourced their care, their meals, their schedules, believing that efficiency could substitute for presence. The evidence of his wound was everywhere in the house. A grand piano in the living room sat silent, covered in a thin layer of dust. Amelia had loved to play. Her art studio on the top floor was locked, a pristine tomb he couldn't bring himself to enter. And on his bedside table, a silver-framed photograph of her, smiling, was turned just slightly away, as if looking at her directly was still too painful. One night, he found Alara in the kitchen, long after the children were asleep. She was looking at her mother's old recipe book, its pages stained and softened with use. Her finger traced over a faded, handwritten recipe for apple pie. "My mom said this could fix anything," she said softly, not realizing he was there. A bad grade, a broken heart, a rainy day. I haven't made it in a long time. Julian stood in the shadows, silent. He understood. He had his own talismans of grief, his own locked rooms and turned away photographs. Her recipe book, his wife's studio. They were monuments to a love that still lived, a pain that still breathed. In that quiet kitchen, he saw their shared humanity. She was not just the help, and he was not just the boss. They were two people, adrift in their own private oceans of loss, who had, by some strange twist of fate, found a quiet harbor in the same house. The wounds were still open, but for the first time, in the presence of another who understood without needing words, they felt a little less alone. The air was no longer just filled with sorrow. It held the faint, fragile possibility of healing. The change was gradual, then all at once. The Croft mansion, once a monument to quiet grief, began to feel like a home. It started in the kitchen. What had been Alara's solitary domain became the house's gravitational center. Leo would now run their first after school. Not to the playroom, eager to show Alara his latest playground scrape or to help her by taste-testing cookie dough. Lily started bringing her sketchbook to the large kitchen island, drawing quietly while Alara prepared dinner, the comforting sounds of chopping and simmering a new soundtrack to her life. She started drawing people again. Leo chasing the dog, Alara smiling, and even a tentative portrait of her father, his brow less furrowed than usual. Julian found himself drawn there too. He began leaving the office at 6 instead of 9. He'd walk in, shed the armor of Julian Croft, CEO, and become just Dad. He'd lean against the counter, loosening his tie, and ask about their day. At first, the children's answers were hesitant, unaccustomed to his presence. But Alara, with a gentle prompt, "Lily, show your dad the drawing you did of the oak tree," would bridge the gap. She created a space for them to reconnect, acting as a quiet conductor for a family that had forgotten its own music. Movie nights became a weekly ritual. Before, the children watched films on their own tablets in their separate rooms. Now, Alara would make a giant bowl of popcorn, and they would all pile onto the enormous living room couch. Leo burrowed under one of Julian's arms, Lily curled up at the other end, and Alara seated quietly nearby. During one such evening, watching a classic animated film, Leo fell asleep, his head resting on Julian's chest. Julian looked down at his son's peaceful face, the steady rise and fall of his small body, and felt a surge of love so fierce it almost hurt. He looked across the couch at Alara, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the screen, a soft smile playing on her lips. It hit him then with the force of a physical blow. This was what he had been missing, this feeling of simple, uncomplicated contentment. This was home. Alara's competence extended beyond the emotional sphere. She ran the household with a quiet efficiency that put his highly paid executive assistants to shame. She noticed things. She realized Lily was squinting and gently suggested an eye exam, which revealed the girl needed glasses. She saw Leo's boundless energy and enrolled him in a weekend soccer clinic, where he thrived. She wasn't just a caretaker. She was a partner in raising his children, intuitive and deeply invested. The locked art studio became a silent testament to the shift. One afternoon, Lily stood before it, her hand on the doorknob. "Alara says Mommy would want me to see her paintings," she told Julian, her voice trembling slightly. It was a challenge he couldn't refuse. Together, they unlocked the door. The room was just as Amelia had left it. Canvases leaning against walls, the scent of oil paint still faintly in the air. It was a space heavy with memory. Julian felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but as Lily walked through the room, her small hand in his, he saw it through her eyes. It wasn't a tomb, it was a legacy. Later that week, he found Alara in the studio, not touching anything, just looking at an unfinished canvas on an easel, a swirling vortex of blues and golds. "She was incredibly talented," Alara said, her voice full of awe. "She saw the world in such a vibrant way." "She did," Julian said, standing beside her. "She was the color. I was just the frame." "A frame is important," Alara replied softly. It holds everything together. It gives the color shape. He looked at her then, at her plain, honest face and her eyes that held so much quiet wisdom. She wasn't just bringing warmth back into his house. She was helping him reframe his own life. She was showing him that the broken pieces could be put back together, not in the same way as before, but into a new shape, one that was strong and beautiful in its own right. The surge of life in the house was undeniable. Laughter echoed in the halls. The aroma of good food lingered in the air. The children were happy, truly happy, for the first time in over a year. And Julian Croft, the man who had everything, realized he was falling in love with the one person who had given him the only thing that mattered, his family, back. It was a feeling both exhilarating and terrifying. The idyllic bubble they had built was fragile, made of glass, and the outside world was about to throw a stone. The inciting incident was innocuous. A father-daughter day at the city zoo. Julian, for the first time in years, had cleared his entire Saturday schedule. He, Alara, Lily, and Leo spent the day looking at monkeys, eating ice cream and laughing. They looked, to any casual observer, like a normal, happy family. But Julian Croft was never a casual observer's subject. A photographer for a notorious society gossip blog, hunting for celebrity sightings, snapped a picture. It was a candid shot. Julian, smiling, is wiping a smudge of chocolate ice cream from Leo's chin while Alara looks on. Her expression one of pure, unguarded affection. Lily is holding her hand. The photo, stripped of its innocent context, was explosive. The headline, plastered across the internet the next morning, was salacious and cruel. Croft's comfort. Billionaire replaces late wife with the nanny. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and classist condescension. It painted Alara as a conniving opportunist, a pretty but plain nobody who had expertly manipulated a grieving billionaire. It questioned Julian's judgment, framing his happiness as a scandalous betrayal of his sainted late wife's memory. It mentioned her modest background, her previous jobs, twisting her life story into a sordid tale of social climbing. The shockwave hit Julian first. His phone began buzzing before dawn with calls from his PR team, his board chairman, and concerned, wealthy friends, the carefully curated image of the stoic, grieving widower dedicated to his work and his wife's legacy was shattered. In its place was the tawdry cliché of the rich man and the help. He felt a white-hot rage, followed by a cold, creeping dread. It wasn't about him. It was about Alara and the children. He found Alara in the kitchen, her face pale, staring at her phone. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and humiliation. I didn't, she stammered, unable to finish. I know, he said, his voice tight. This is not your fault. It's a lie, but the lie was powerful. The pressure mounted throughout the day. The chairman of the Croft Foundation's board called an emergency meeting. The foundation was Amelia's legacy, a massive philanthropic endeavor supporting arts education for underprivileged children. Their largest donors were old money families, staunchly conservative and obsessed with appearances. Julian, the optics on this are a catastrophe. The chairman, a man named Sterling, said, his voice oozing false sympathy. The donors are rattled. They see this as an insult to Amelia's memory. They're threatening to pull their funding. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars. It's a photograph from the zoo, Julian snapped, his patience wearing thin. It's a photograph of you, your children, and your domestic employee looking like a cozy family unit. It suggests instability, poor judgment. People are saying this woman has you wrapped around her little finger. The words hung in the sterile boardroom air, ugly and poisonous. He was being asked to choose between the woman who had healed his family and the legacy he had built for his dead wife. To protect the foundation, to protect his children from the vicious public scrutiny, to stop the relentless hounding of the press that was already starting to camp outside his gates. He was being told there was only one solution. He had to fire Alara. The conversation was the hardest of his life. He found her packing a small bag in her room. She hadn't waited to be told. Her face was calm, resigned, but her eyes were shadowed with a pain that cut him to the core. I understand, she said before he could even speak, her voice barely a whisper. It's for the best. For the children. Alara, I don't want this, he said, his own voice cracking. But the media, the foundation, they won't leave you alone. They won't leave the kids alone. I have to protect you. I have to protect them. I know, she said, zipping the bag. She wouldn't look at him. Each word was a betrayal of the warmth and trust they had built. He was choosing optics over authenticity, the foundation's reputation over the heart of his own home. He was letting the cold, cynical world win. He was sending her away. As she walked toward the door, she paused. Take care of them, Mr. Croft. The formality was a knife twisting in his gut. She had gone back to being an employee. The family they had started to build was just a fantasy, shattered by a single photograph. He watched her walk down the long hallway and out the door, the sound of its closing echoing the final, deafening slam on the happiest chapter of his life since Amelia. The house was instantly, terrifyingly silent. The warmth was gone. The silence in the days that followed was a suffocating presence. The house, which had just begun to breathe again, was now holding its breath. Leo's laughter was gone, replaced by sullen moods and angry outbursts. Lily retreated into herself, her new glasses perched on a face that was perpetually drawn and sad. She stopped drawing. Julian tried to fill the void Alara had left, but it was like trying to fill the Grand Canyon with a teaspoon. He made pancakes that were burnt on the outside and raw on the inside. He read bedtime stories in a monotone voice that put him to sleep before the children. The carefully constructed machine of their lives was running again, but its heart had been removed. The mansion was once again just a house, cold and vast and empty. The victory over the media felt hollow. The gossip cycle moved on, the donors were placated, and the foundation was secure. Sterling called to congratulate him on handling the situation with decisive leadership. Julian hung up the phone feeling sick. He had sacrificed the woman he loved to appease men he didn't respect. He had protected his wife's legacy by betraying the very values of love and family she had cherished. One evening, he found Lily in her room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by all the drawings she had made since Alara arrived. In the center was the one she had made of the garden gnome, the first olive branch. She wasn't looking at them. She was just sitting there, a small, lonely island in a sea of colorful paper. I miss her, Lily whispered, her voice so quiet he barely heard it. She made everything better. I know, sweetie, Julian said, his own voice thick. I miss her too. Then why did you make her go away? The question was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. It was the question he had been asking himself every waking moment. Because he was a coward. Because he had cared more about what people thought than about what was right. He had let the optics win. In that moment, looking at his daughter's heartbroken face, something inside him shifted. The grief for Amelia, which had defined him for so long, finally gave way to a new, sharper clarity. Amelia wouldn't have wanted this. She would have despised his cowardice. She would have told him to fight for the people he loved, regardless of the consequences. His stand didn't begin with a press conference or a grand gesture. It began with a phone call. He called Sterling. We're holding a press conference tomorrow at the Foundation headquarters, Julian announced, his voice cold and clear. There's been a change in leadership. What are you talking about, Julian? Everything is back on track. No, it's not, Julian said. I'm dissolving the current board, including you, Sterling. The Croft Foundation will no longer be managed by men who value public perception over human decency. Amelia's legacy deserves better. Before Sterling could sputter a reply, Julian hung up. His next call was to his head of PR. Cancel all my meetings, and get me the address for Alara Sanchez. The next day, Julian Croft stood before a throng of reporters at the foundation. He didn't look like a CEO. He wore a simple dark suit, but his tie was slightly loosened, and his prepared speech lay untouched on the podium. I called you here today to talk about the Croft Foundation, he began, his voice steady. This foundation was created to honor my late wife, Amelia. She was an artist who believed that beauty and kindness could change the world. She believed in authenticity. And lately, I have failed to live up to those values. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the surprised faces. A few weeks ago, you all wrote stories about a woman named Alara Sanchez. You portrayed her as a gold digger and me as a fool. You were wrong. Alara Sanchez is a woman of greater integrity, kindness, and strength than anyone I have ever known. She came into my home and healed my family when I was incapable of doing so myself. She brought light into a house that had been dark for a very long time. I let public pressure and misguided advice force me to send her away. That was a mistake. It was a failure of character, and it is my deepest regret. My wife's legacy isn't about appeasing wealthy donors. It's about supporting those who create beauty and goodness in the world. And no one embodies that more than Alara. He looked directly into the main camera. He wasn't speaking to the press anymore. He was speaking to her. I am publicly and privately asking for her forgiveness. And I am announcing the Foundation's new primary initiative. The Alara Project, a grant program dedicated to supporting community caregivers, the nannies, nurses, and home aides who mend our families in quiet, essential ways, and who deserve our utmost respect, not our condescension. It was a stunning public defense. He had torched his own board, alienated his donors, and laid his heart bare for the world to see. He had chosen his values. He had chosen her. He had finally made his stand. After the press conference, Julian didn't wait to see the fallout. He didn't care about the stock price or the frantic calls from his now former board members. There was only one thing that mattered. He drove himself, ignoring his waiting chauffeur, to the address his team had found for Alara. It was a modest, walk-up apartment building in a neighborhood that felt a world away from his glass and steel fortress. The paint was peeling on the window frames, and the sound of traffic was a constant hum. He walked up the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He had no idea what he would say. "I'm sorry" felt inadequate. "I love you" felt premature and undeserved. He knocked on the door, number 3B. For a long moment, there was no answer. He was about to knock again when the door opened. Alara stood there, looking tired and thinner than he remembered. She was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, and her eyes were wide with shock. A television was on in the small apartment behind her, and he could hear the faint sound of his own voice from the press conference. She had seen it. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The name was still a barrier between them. "Julian," he corrected her gently. "Please, can I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him into the small, clean living room. It was sparsely furnished, but a few of her sketches were taped to the walls, infusing the space with a quiet personality. It was a room that felt like her. "I saw what you did," she said, her arms crossed over her chest, a protective gesture. "It was a very grand gesture." "It wasn't a gesture," he said, his voice earnest. "It was a correction. I made a terrible mistake, Alara. I let fear and pressure dictate my actions. I hurt you and I hurt my children, and I broke the best thing that's happened to my family in years. I am so sorry." She listened, her expression unreadable. "The children," she said, her voice softening. "How are they?" "They're miserable," he admitted, the truth raw and painful. "I'm miserable. The house, it's just a building without you. You were the one who made it a home." He took a tentative step closer. Lily stopped drawing. "Leo, he asked me if you left because he was bad." The words caught in his throat. Alara's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Oh, Leo," she whispered. "It's not home without Alara," Julian said, echoing the words his son had said to him, the words that had galvanized his resolve. "That's what Leo told me. And he's right." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper. It was the drawing Lily had made of their family. Him, Leo, Lily, and standing right in the center, holding both children's hands, was Alara. He had found it on her empty bed after she left. "Lily drew this for you," he said, holding it out to her. "She wants you in the picture." "I want you in the picture." Alara took the drawing, her fingers tracing the crayon stick figure of herself. She looked from the drawing to his face, her eyes searching his. The doubt and hurt were still there, but underneath, a flicker of the warmth he had missed so desperately was returning. "I don't want to be your nanny, Julian," she said, her voice finding its strength. "I can't go back to being an employee." "I'm not asking you to be," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate. "I'm asking you to come back to us, to be a part of our family, in whatever way you want, as a friend, as a partner, as anything. We just need you back." It wasn't a proposal of marriage, but it was a proposal of a life, a shared life. He was standing on her threshold, not as a billionaire offering a job, but as a man offering his broken, hopeful heart. She looked at him, at the genuine remorse and desperate hope in his eyes. She thought of Leo's mischievous grin and Lily's quiet intensity. She thought of the feeling of rightness, of belonging she had felt in that house. She gave a small, tremulous nod. "Okay, Julian," she whispered. Okay, the single word was enough. It was everything. The reunion wasn't a passionate embrace or a cinematic kiss. It was a quiet, profound sense of relief, the feeling of two fractured pieces finally clicking back into place. It was a new beginning, built not on a fairy tale, but on the solid ground of forgiveness and a shared, desperate need for home. Alara's return was not a return to the status quo. She came back not as an employee, but as an integral part of the family's foundation. The title was unspoken, undefined, and all the more powerful for it. The children, overjoyed, clung to her, the house instantly regaining its light and warmth. But for Julian and Alara, a new, deliberate chapter was beginning. They were building something together, and it needed to be more than just a household. The conversation happened one evening in the kitchen, their new sanctuary, after the kids were asleep. Alara was sketching in her old notepad, something she had started doing again. Julian watched her, the way her hand moved with such innate confidence. "The Alara project," he said softly. "It's real. I've endowed it with an initial $20 million. But it needs a director, someone with vision and empathy, someone who understands what it means to care." Alara looked up from her drawing, her eyes wide. "Julian, I don't have any experience running a foundation." "You have life experience," he countered. "You deferred your own dreams to care for your mother. You understand the sacrifice. You know what these caregivers need, what support would actually make a difference. It's not about boardrooms and galas. It's about people." He saw the hesitation and the flicker of an old, buried dream in her eyes. "What did you want to be, Alara?" he asked gently. "Before you had to take care of everyone else. What was your dream?" She looked down at her worn sketchbook, at the faint outlines of faces and landscapes. "I wanted to be an artist," she confessed, the words tasting strange after years of silence. "I got into the City Art Institute, but life happened. An idea began to form in Julian's mind, connecting the past to the future. Amelia's foundation was for arts education," he said, thinking aloud. "What if we merged the two ideas? The Alara project could provide scholarships and grants not just for practical support, but for pursuing deferred dreams. We could fund art classes for home health aides, music lessons for nannies, creative writing workshops for elder care workers. We could give back the gift of creativity to those who give so much of themselves." Alara's face lit up with a passion he hadn't seen before. It was the face of the girl who had dreamed of canvas and color. "We could build a community center," she said, her voice gaining excitement. "A place with a real kitchen, not a soup kitchen but a teaching kitchen, where people can learn to cook nutritious, comforting food. We could have an art studio open to everyone. A place for people to heal and create." Her vision was so clear, so heartfelt. She wasn't thinking about budgets or logistics. She was thinking about human connection. She was sketching a community with her words. "My mother's recipe book," she said, her eyes shining. "It's full of simple meals that made us feel loved and safe. Food is care. Art is care. It's all connected." Their mission was born in that moment. It was a perfect fusion of their pasts. Amelia's artistic legacy, Alara's deferred dreams and her mother's nurturing spirit, and Julian's resources and desire to build something meaningful. They spent the next few months working side by side. Julian handled the business end, securing a building in a neglected part of the city and navigating the legal labyrinth of establishing the new foundation. Alara was the heart and soul. She designed the space, ensuring the kitchen was warm and inviting, that the art studio had the best possible natural light. She met with community leaders, caregivers, and families, listening to their stories and needs. They were a team. They argued over paint colors and fundraising strategies. They celebrated small victories, the first major donation from a source other than Julian, the day the sign for the Hearth and Easel Community Center was installed. Through the shared work, their bond deepened. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and 2 children in a house. They were partners, building a future that extended beyond their own front door. One afternoon, they stood in the nearly completed community kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleamed, and the large butcher block island stood waiting. Alara ran her hand over the smooth wood. "I think my mom would have liked this place," she said quietly. Julian came to stand beside her, his arm brushing against hers. "I know Amelia would have," he said. He looked around the room, at the tangible result of their shared purpose. He had spent his life building a corporate empire, a legacy of profit and power. But this felt different. This felt real. This was a legacy of kindness. And it was a mission he was proud to share with her. The opening of the Hearth and Easel Community Center was not a lavish gala. There were no celebrities or society reporters. Instead, the small building was filled with the cheerful noise of neighborhood families, caregivers on their day off, and children marveling at the fully stocked art studio. The air smelled of fresh paint and the rich aroma of the tomato soup Alara and a team of volunteers were serving, the first recipe from her mother's book Maid in the new kitchen. Alara moved through the crowd with a quiet, confident grace, her face glowing. She was in her element, connecting with people, making sure everyone felt welcome. Julian watched her from a corner, Lily and Leo at his side. He had never seen her look more beautiful. She wasn't wearing a designer gown, just a simple blue dress, but she radiated a light that outshone any diamond. Later that evening, long after the last guest had departed and the center was quiet, they returned home. The children, exhausted and happy, were asleep almost before their heads hit their pillows. Julian found Alara in their own kitchen, wiping down the counters, a small, contented smile on her face. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable, lived-in silence, not the aching emptiness of before. "Today was amazing," Julian said, his voice soft in the stillness. "You were amazing. We were amazing," she corrected him, turning to face him. "It was a good day." He walked over to the kitchen island where her mother's old recipe book lay open. He picked up a pen that was lying nearby. His hand hesitated for a moment over the inside cover. On the first page, in faded ink, was the inscription, "For my Alara. May this book always bring you home." He looked at her, his expression serious, his heart in his eyes. "This book is about home," he said. "And you are my home, Alara. You are our home." He uncapped the pen. Below her mother's inscription, in his own strong, clear handwriting, he wrote, "And Julian, and Lily, and Leo." He put the pen down and turned the book so she could see. Her name, and now his and the children's. A family, inscribed in ink, bound together in a book of recipes and love. Alara's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. It was more profound than any diamond, more binding than any legal document. It was a promise. "There's just one thing missing," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't present a ring. He just stood there, in the heart of the home she had rebuilt, and laid his soul bare. "The title on the deed to this house still just says Croft. Feels wrong. It should say Croft Sanchez. Or maybe just Sanchez Croft. We can argue about the order later." A teary laugh escaped her. "Will you stay, Alara?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you make this our home, officially? Forever?" She didn't need to say yes. Her answer was in the way she stepped forward, closing the small space between them, and rested her head against his chest, her arms wrapping around him. It was the feeling of a key finally turning in a lock. It was the quiet, certain click of coming home. In a world that often measures worth by status and wealth, their story stands as a quiet reminder that the greatest value lies in kindness, integrity, and the simple courage to choose love. True wealth isn't what you own. It's the home you build in the hearts of others. What will you choose to build today?